atheism, right? The notion that there is no God, essentially. Now, I'm not going to confirm atheism. I do think it's important to recognize that if there were no God, for instance, no soul or spirituality, independent from our human sense of perception, that would make this life, well, assuming that this world is real, right? Because people argue, well, can this world exist independent of consciousness? You know, scientific consensus is the world's been around for billions of years, irrespective of whether there were humans to actually witness it, right? So this real world is all we can really know, even if our perception of it is filtered through our consciousness, right? Different animals have a certain scope of perception, like the colors they see, and so on and so forth. They don't have the same abstract reasoning, but there's proto-abstraction, planning, so on and so forth. Among some species, they still have instincts and temperaments and desires and drives. And even animals, like in extreme isolation or deprivation, they can harm themselves. And it's an effort to reduce pain, not conceive of a death. Because animals don't, as far as I'm concerned, don't have an awareness of their demise. Right, even witnessing other animals pass. But if it were true that there were no afterlife, no reincarnation, no simulation theory, because now we're in the age of information technology, so the new gods would be the simulators and our soul would be information. In the past, it was the spirits and the gods and so on and so forth. Then that would make this life ever more significant, because you, as a subject, me, I, right? All you are, as far as from a strictly biological standpoint, is a consciousness, a brain, a series of sensations, interpretations, right? A physical form. But the I, the soul, right? Can the soul be separate from any experiential basis in reality? Right? Because how could the soul be responsible for something the body or mind does in this real world? Right? If the soul were sent to an afterlife, it would have to be bound to the constraints of physics. Right? We're assuming hell is a physical place. To feel sensations like suffering would require a physical form. In neurochemistry, which the soul can't necessarily have, right? So the soul is based off of the human form. If anything, the soul would be something we can't necessarily even conceive of, but we don't question the spiritual eternity of an animal because they don't have the same free will, according to theists. Even though one could argue free will is dubious, considering, we have altered states of consciousness at times. That doesn't mean we're exempt from, being responsible, but it does mean that we may only act insofar as we are able to have a sense of free will, as I acknowledge. But in any case, if it were true that there were no afterlife, no God, that would make your actions ever more important, right? Because now you will not live on in another life, in another form. Your actions, they will ripple on for eternity. So whatever you did will influence others, will influence the world. Your organic matter, the elements in your body, they will become part of the soil. They will be part of the universe. In some sense, we come from the stars. So the physical constituents of your body will transmigrate somewhere, and the idea of you in the memory of the collective consciousness may persist. Unless, of course, you didn't make much of an impact on the world, but it can still persist in the lives of others. Some part of you will still be out there, some part of your body, but you, the self, that might not necessarily persist anywhere. So that just makes your life here and now ever more important, right? If you go to heaven or hell, what do you learn ultimately? When you're suffering in hell for eternity, what impact does that have on humanity? Right? No one's there to witness your suffering, only the idea of it. So if anything, spiritual damnation is more concerned with avoiding harm than doing good. Because think about it, there's this idea I had called the one bad moment paradox, where you could be a righteous man for 70 years and then commit a sin. And then that 70 years of your life is negated from that one sin. Say the person harms themselves in some serious way, which I would never advocate for. Well, that 70 years of your life is negated at that point. So the notion of spiritual damnation seems to be more concerned with avoiding harm than doing good. Because how can you go 70 years being a righteous man and then one sin leads you to the pits of hell, right? Seems to be more concerned with social cohesion, which many anthropologists would agree. And so there you go. That makes this life ever more important, because while you may not live on for eternity in another form, your actions can live on forever. What you did in this world will live on forever. If you influenced civilization in some way, that may very well live on for thousands of years. This planet might not exist for forever, but undoubtedly the people that lived before us allow us humans to live the way we do today, with civilization and science and philosophy. They've enabled us to live longer. Imagine how in the past you'd be lucky if you made it past 40. Well, people in that time spearheaded scientific innovations. Now we live longer because of them, right? So that has ceased my fear of death, and that suffering may cease to exist when you pass. I mean, I'm not claiming I know. Maybe there is a soul that goes on, we suffer. That's always possible. But it's not something we can necessarily conceive of or test. It may be possible. Don't get me wrong. I always think there may be like a 5% chance I'm wrong. I don't know if it's true or not. But the point is, atheism is an interesting thought experiment to think, well, how much of what you do is for spiritual redemption? How much of what you do is to fit in, is to avoid harm rather than doing good in the conventional sense of the word? And if your God had diminished, if it turned out it wasn't real, well, would you despair? Would you continue to do good in this life? Or would you just give up because God doesn't exist? That means you're not going to be saved. So it doesn't matter what role you play in this world. That just makes your life ever more important in this world, right? And it ceases that fear of death, because when you die, there's no consciousness, there's no awareness, and we didn't exist for billions of years before we were born. We didn't exist up until the moment of birth, as far as I'm concerned. So yes, you have existed, you will have existed. Your memory would have been there. So in some sense, you may always exist forever. In some sense, the idea, the physical matter, the atoms, they can't be destroyed. Matter can't be created nor destroyed, only recycled. It'll be out there, maybe even in the stars. We all came from a supernova. So the idea of you may exist forever depending on what you do in this life. It could be completely forgotten. And your physical matter will remain somewhere. So you may end up living for eternity, at least until it's no more. So that's the closest you'll get to eternal life. And I don't see it as something to be afraid, because there's no suffering. Suffering ceases to exist. So what's the point of worrying? The fear of death people have is, I think, more about loss. It's about losing what they have. And it's about that the suffering will persist for eternity, right? Because humans, we often try to maximize pleasure, or survival rather, minimize pain or suffering. So the idea that we don't know what occurs next is more frightening than any suffering in this moment. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share today.